And when we really, really look at the picture as a whole and we look at how we as humans influence these systems that sometimes we put ourselves above, but we forget we're still a part of these natural systems. When we look at it in these perspectives, then it makes it easier to think about, how can I look at the land not as a financial, how can I get the most out of it financially, but how can I help balance and sustain these functions, these ecological functions to help the land heal itself.
Latrice Tatsey, whose Piikani name is Buffalo Stone Woman, is a soil scientist, cultural science lead, and intern supervisor for the Piikani Lodge Health Institute of the Blackfeet Nation. A rancher herself on the spectacular Rocky Mountain front of Montana, Latrice works with cattle and bison producers to improve the health of the water, land, and people where her relatives have lived since time immemorial. This episode of Voices from the Field is the first half of a conversation Latrice has with NCAT Sustainable Agriculture Specialist Linda Poole about regenerative grazing, traditional knowledge, and both the utility and limitations of reductionistic science in guiding us to climate solutions. Let's listen.
Hello, listeners. I'm Linda Poole, a grazing specialist with NCAT, and I'm also a shepherd on Montana's northern prairies. Up here where I farm, climate change has already begun rewriting our landscape, our agriculture, and our communities, and not in good ways. This land is traditional home to the Assiniboine, Blackfeet, Crow, and Métis peoples, and it is a land of grass and has been for eons. Today, it's still a place with few people and many animals, many of them ruminants. As this land adapts to the changing climate with our hotter, drier summers, more severe winter storms, more drought, but also worse floods, and always, always more wind, as the land changes, we're all looking for ways to adapt to. Today's honored guest, Latrice Tatsey, comes from the Blackfeet Nation, and she has been looking into this topic of adaptation on the prairies through her graduate research in soil science at Montana State University. I think we have a lot to learn from Latrice, both in terms of Western science and cultural ways to look at the changes that we face in agriculture. So welcome, Latrice, to Voices from the Field.
Thank you, Linda. And I'll just give my cultural introduction. Oki Nistuni Doniku and Niskamaki. That means hello, my name is. My Piikani name is Buffalo Stone Woman. And so it's always important for people of Indigenous background to also introduce themselves with their names from their tribe. Some call them, an Indian name, but that's really important for us, as individuals to recognize those names as they are just as important as our government names, because they become a part of who we are.
Yeah. I think that name is so powerful given the work that you do, and to reflect on the Indian name and the name that you have to write on your IRS information being different. It's different. It also indicates different ways of knowing and being in the land. And I think it's fascinating that you have grounding in both worlds and thinking about soil, and your not just agriculture, but your culture. So I wonder if you can talk with us a little about your research and how that integrates with your place in your community at the Blackfeet Nation.
Of course. So when I was looking at what type of research I wanted to develop for my graduate work, I went back to the land and I sat there and I was thinking, what kind of research can I do that would be meaningful to me and meaningful in ways that contribute back to my community? And so I grew up on my family ranch and surrounded by horses and cows, but I'm also very, very like privileged in some ways that I live in an area where there's a lot of history related to our people and agencies were in the area where my house is in the teepee rings from the dog days, and how it transferred to the horse days, and looking at the buffalo drive lines while watching our while looking at our cows. And so being able to understand that there are two parts to me that make me who I am, that brings a diversity that a lot don't have in some regards. So I get to hone those relationships that are culturally enriched in who I am as a person, and understanding what our roles are within on Mother Earth. And then also having the background of the Western science and seeing the data and how decisions and management practices have led us to some of the crises that we're in. And so going back and sitting with the land and trying to figure out a project, I really wanted to look at grazing and how cattle and bison or any grazing influence the health of soil based on the relationships and how they graze, and what those relationships could show, through respiration in the soil. And so sitting there, it wasn't, it all just come to me while sitting there, but the first thing that I wanted to understand was those relationships to grazing based on these two animals. And so that part of it really took off, but I was really grounded in the cultural science part of it, but wanting to know that in science they want you to, have these study sites, and there's a control, and then you have different models. But I didn't want to do that science because I feel like there's so many manipulations that you can make, and I wanted to fully see what the natural relationship was based on the grazing that they were currently doing and how they moved themselves on the landscape. And so that's where this research really started. And as I started doing it and talking to people, it started to evolve into these other projects while I was, finishing my degree at MSU. And so having those backgrounds and knowing the relationships that I have with the land really was my guiding, my blueprint on how I wanted to do research.
Mm. Yeah, that's such a rich and integrated background. And I heard you use the word holistic in there, just really trying to think about not reducing everything to mechanics. I think that's part of what's gotten us into trouble over time. I live way far east of you. I've always thought of your part of the world as the home of the west wind, because every time the wind blows from the west, I'm more towards the east side of the traditional Blackfeet territory, and it's always like, so were the people just blown over here? We definitely get your wind. And when I was driving over to visit you last week in Browning, when I go from my area, which is Malta, across over to you, it's a 4-hour drive. And almost that entire distance is wheat fields, small grains. And we call it the Golden Triangle for listeners who aren't from here. And yeah, there's a lot of grain that's grown here, but I was so struck by thinking about what this would have been like 200 years ago and the changes that have happened. I understand 14,000 years at least on this land. Latrice, is that right for the tribes?
You know, Linda, our stories go back, and in our stories, it always goes to time immemorial. And so, you know, science will say we were here this long based on the evidence that they find, but our stories go beyond the science aspect of it. And so for us, you know, it's not in that time frame. Our stories connect us to the land. So any indigenous person, when you ask, you know, have you been here based on, you know, these scientific dates, it's always going to be the stories that go back to connect them, that go further back than science ever will.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I appreciate learning from you about these things, even if it was only 13,000 years, even if it was only 1,300 years that your people have been here. It is so much deeper knowledge and coevolution with this landscape than any of us. And I looked at all that tractor torn land and, you know, part of the breadbasket of America, and thinking about the climate change that's impacting all of us. I felt like as I was driving across the prairie, I was almost driving across a timeline, and not one where I'm driving backwards into the old times, but where I'm driving forward into thinking about, I'm going to go see people who have adapted to so many different changes over time on this land. And what can we learn from them? And that's really my question to you. You know, from your research and from your life experience, what can we learn about adapting to climate change in these northern prairies?
You know, for me, Linda, that always goes back to being on the land and the relationship that we've had with the land. And so honing that aspect of it and the values that go to that is always a guiding point. And you know, through learning through our ways and our lens, we've always learned through the animals. We've observed them. And for me, that was kind of what I was doing on my research, is I was just observing these animals and learning from them. And for me, as a Piikani woman from the Blackfeet Nation, it's going back to those teachings. And so when we are looking at the environment and we are looking at, you know, what can we do, you know, as a management plan, you know, what could we write, or how can we, you know, kind of come in and try to manipulate a system? What it really comes down to is just really going out there and seeing what it could be in its most natural state. We're not going to get, you know, to the pristine before disturbance by humans, but we're going to go find areas where the ecosystem is very intact. And so when you look at these places, you're like, okay, this is what the land can be like. What steps do we gotta take in order to go there? And for each community, those vary, and they vary in the ways based on the needs of the community, the resources of the community, and all of those things that come together. And so when we really look at the picture as a whole, and we look at how we as humans influence these systems, that sometimes we put ourselves above, but we forget we're still a part of these natural systems. When we look at it in these perspectives, then it makes it easier to think about, you know, how can I look at the land not as like a financial, how can I get the most out of it financially, but how can I help balance and sustain these functions, these ecological functions to help the land heal itself. Then we're really getting to the holism or to the bigger picture of how we as society can contribute back to the land.
Yeah, this makes me think about what I heard you say in one of our meetings last week. In those discussions, listeners, we were kind of talking about how we relate to one another as people, and how NCAT, which is a partner to Piikani Lodge, which we'll talk about soon, on a regenerative grazing study, how partners like NCAT can be helpful, recognizing that we're not saviors and recognizing that we are the newcomers, and that in many cases we are the learners. And one of the things that Latrice told me then that I think really relates to this is it's all about relationships. It's not really so much what each thing, each idea, each practice, each community is. It's about the interconnections between them and the quality of those, and how those are managed. And I think it's just as true with agricultural systems and food systems as it is in family dynamics. It's all about relations.
Learn how to harvest the sun twice with practical information at NCAT's AgriSolar Clearinghouse. Get access to more than 400 peer-reviewed articles, the latest in agri-solar news, and connect with farmers and solar developers who are working together to make the most out of our shared resources. We'll see you at agrisolarclearinghouse.org.
I was, in prepping for this call, I was looking at a wonderful video that came out a few months ago from Stories for Action and the Iron Shield Creative. It's called Life in the Land, Amskapi, Piikani, Blackfeet Nation. And in that, Joe Kipp was talking about the Blackfeet way. It's about being respectful to the earth, respectful to one another, respectful to animals, to your values, and to yourself. And to me, respectful relationship is so much what we're trying to learn. In another thing that I looked at, and I knew you from this book before I actually got to talk to you, Latrice, and that is Liz Carlisle's recent book called Healing Grounds: Climate Justice and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming. And in that book, she talks about, and you talk about, and your dad, Terry, talks about something that I think is critical. And these words have changed my life. And it's just the concept of living with respect with that which is given. And to me, that's so different than what we've done with huge tractors and international food systems that have us, I raise sheep, my wool goes to Billings, and then goes to China, and then goes to Italy, and then comes back to the US. It's just, it doesn't feel like a respectful relationship with the land and each other. And so I'm blathering a lot because I'm hoping, as I'm doing this, that then what you'll be able to do is to bring us back down to ground, and how looking at buffalo and cattle and soil on your landscape there, how that brings us into respectful, proper relationship so that we can do a better job in the future.
For sure. And what that brings me back to, Linda, is the time before there were fences, a time before there was a push to just get all the land that you could. And it was, thinking back to when there was a diversity of animal species out there: buffalo, elk, deer, grizzly bears. In looking at the diversity of those relationships and how they were able to move throughout the land. And they weren't, in a way, defined by certain areas they could or couldn't go. So they were able to move these vast areas and utilize them and then move on and, let them rest for a year or not go back there for 2 years, and so going back to knowing how the land evolved before, there was plows, before there were fences. And so for me, that was really looking at how our people used fire to burn the grasslands to bring them back greener, and how that was important to do after they would harvest in an area to burn, and learning about how our practices were correlated to knowing how the buffalo moved and using those management practices to have these animals come to these areas, or know that you wanted to burn there so that they would come back to these areas. So, going back to those teachings and knowing that, there was ways that the lands were managed, but they were based on how the animals moved. We don't have our large territories anymore. Our land bases broke way down. And now we have the infrastructure of fences. And so now the challenge on our part, and the challenges that we face today, are how do we work with the land to help heal the land so that the animals have a similar relationship to where they're grazing for those time periods. I hear, the regenerative grazing terms, but for me, the way I think about it and the way I had to go back, so it really like captured who I am as a person, so I could understand what these practices were in a much bigger sense, was looking at those past relationships and how our people worked with the land in the Indian, the bison, or buffalo. And so going back to that and understanding, why we have to have these animals moving so these lands can rest, and how we can have better management practices to offset some of the crises that we're facing now. The Blackfeet Nation is at the headwaters, and we're still dealing with a lot of drought in our areas, even our producers, where there were large amounts of prairie potholes and these kettles and these, springs that ran year round. With the drought and the climate that we are dealing with now, those are becoming less and less. And so with our management practices and plans, it's really gone back to how do we adapt? How do we go back to who we are in our ways to create management plans and practices? And for grazing, for me, it was really going back to the buffalo. And for looking at water, capturing water and how to store water, the more I learned of these Sustaki projects that BCC was doing and that the Blackfeet Environmental Office was doing in the snow fence models that were being developed, I was like, this is the next level management practices that we really need to look into. And so for me, it was, it's really going back to these keystone species and seeing what their relationships are to the land and seeing how we can mimic those within the practices and the science that's already back behind them, but then knowing the cultural relevance that they have and how that relationship to our culture and how our local producers value that. For me, that's a way to really tie everything together, working within our snow fence practices and wanting to use those to install at reservoirs in different areas to help our ranchers capture more water, to do the beaver mimicry where beaver no longer have access to, are in these plains where there's no streams or any type of large water bodies that they need to sustain themselves, but putting in these mimicry, but finding those values and those ways and how to hold the water those benefits not only for grazing, but for the microclimates and all the systems that depend on above ground water, because, we're losing more and more of that as each year passes.
Mhm. Yeah, it dawns on me that you and I both we can picture the landscape that you're on, but we haven't painted that for our listeners. Can you tell us just a little bit about topography and elevation and soils, and just kind of paint the setting? I feel like when you talk about beaver mimicry and the snow fences, it'll be a lot more valuable if people are grounded in your landscape a little bit.
For sure, for sure. So I, again, I'm on the Blackfeet Nation, surrounded by the Rocky Mountain front, bordered by the Canadian line, right by Glacier National Park in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And so a lot of those lands are part of our ceded territories. And so if you can imagine Glacier National Park and the glacier history that comes down, well, our lands are the remnants of where those glaciers went through. Our soils are from those glacial tills. And so up by Chief Mountain, we have that deep history, and a lot of them are, talk about the different faults, Lewis Fault, Lewis Thrust Fault, and the magic of Chief Mountain based on the geological features. And as you come down, we have these vast foothills, and if you can imagine, if you're coming from the diversity of the mountains down to the foothills, and as it goes down to the plains, so you have a vast change of land topography. But then that also comes to plant species, soils, animals, and everything. So we have such a abundant diversity here on the Blackfeet Nation of wildlife, vast amount of wildlife, bird species. And so we hone so much ecological richness that we need to ensure we keep protecting it. And so that end goal of all these management practices is about sustaining those ecological relationships so that our earth can maintain and take care of itself, because we are the ones who depend on the land to take care of us.
Yeah, you are the ones who depend on the land to take care of you. And also going back to that video that I mentioned, that was done by Stories for Action. One of the leaders of this Piikani Lodge regenerative grazing work is Kristen Kipp, and in that video she talks about it's a Blackfeet value to conserve, to use wisely the resources. And I think maybe it's her dad in there who talks about it's and I'm not using the right words, but what I got in my mind is just the comparison of so many of us who do not have a tribal culture behind us think of the land as something that we own and that we have dominion over. And what I think I feel when I was there in Browning last week and reading and watching these videos where you're talking is, it's more, if somebody owns somebody, it's the land that owns your people and counts on you to steward that land. And it is true for us too. It's just that we don't recognize it a lot of times. When you talk about how the land has been partitioned into smaller pieces, I'm a wildlife biologist. I like birds a lot, and especially little brown birds, little migratory birds like the lark bunting that's out here on the prairie. And they've been successful for eons too. But they've done it because they were flexible. And if it's not a good year in one place, they can go somewhere else. And they could move across the landscape. And now we can't move across the landscape. And that pushes so many of us into ever more technological interventions. So there's not enough water that comes down from the sky anymore. And so I'm going to put in an irrigation system. I can't find local buyers for the products that I produce. And so they're going to go on trucks and go all over the world. And we just keep getting more and more technological. And at the same time, I feel like the earth is telling us that, time is running out for that strategy. It's why I wanted to talk with you. It's why I'm intrigued by this regenerative grazing study that we're doing, where we're trying to think of ways that we can have the prairies produce healthy food and sustain cultures and be profitable and have the land catch and hold more water and be resilient. Maybe it would be good, Latrice, would you mind talking with our listeners a little bit about the regenerative grazing project and Piikani Lodge?
For sure, for sure. So what we're looking at doing, Linda, is working with local producers to steer away from continuous grazing and seasonal continuous grazing to do more of a rotational grazing system and integrate it in a way to where we are working with the bigger issues besides saying, we want to do regenerative grazing, but looking at the issues that ranchers are dealing with, whether it's fencing infrastructure, water development infrastructure, and then we have a huge feral horse problem here, and really understanding what the true challenges are for their local operation and meeting them where they're at, because what we have found is it's not a one shoe fits all.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to make sure that we are meeting them where they are and finding what resources that we have available to help them so that they can integrate these practices onto their operations. Because what we found, or what I've really found since doing this work, is it can be integrated until we have the infrastructures in place so the producers and the ranch operators have the tools that they need to integrate these practices. Because what has happened in Indian country is a lot of the times we were underserved, historically underserved in a lot of programs. And so that has really created some challenges for the current operators and the families that have the ranches passed down from generation to generation, because that's how it worked locally. But what we're finding is it's becoming so hard that a lot of people aren't continuing those operations, and they're selling their land back to the tribe because of a lot of the adversity that they face just to be an operator. And so we are working with the ones who, are continuing regardless of all the struggles that they face, because, they have some of the resources to keep going, and they want to keep it going because it's important to who they are as a person. And so, when it really comes down to those factors, you want to work with them, because what you start to understand is some of the crises that we are in now are because of the management decisions that were made for us when we were under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and when we had agencies in different leaders who were bringing animals here before our people understood that how, all this intensive grazing was really going to impact the grasses that were available at that time. And I hear stories of my uncle saying, they remember the grasses were so tall that, you could run through them. And now I'm looking at grasslands where, because of the drought and the impact of the grazing that it has had now, that some of the grassland isn't as lush, and you're seeing a lot of rocks and you're seeing a lot of soil erosion. So wanting to really work with those producers who see those things too and want to find ways to be better land stewards, but understanding that what it really comes down to with them is infrastructure and these different, developments. And so that's where Piikani Lodge is really coming in, whether, we are supplying solar electric fence, the training with the interns to, train the cows to the fence, and then, going out and helping the ranchers install the electric fence and helping them train their cows. And for us, it's going out and taking soil tests and forage tests to really get the baselines of the land and see where the land is at, to help them make decisions that are going to benefit the next generations. Because for me, that's what this work always comes down to, is I always understand that if it wasn't for my father, my grandfather, my grandmother, my great grandparents, and so on, for fighting with everything to not have to sell the land where we're at, and to maintain it where there was all those challenges. And so wanting to make sure that we are there for those families, because those relationships for the land are so important. So that's where PHLI really comes, because it comes from knowing the communities and knowing the producers that you serve. Because when it comes down to it, you know what their struggles are, and you always want to find ways and solutions to get past the problems.
Yeah, I'm so impressed with the ability to change the zoom, zooming in and out with, specifically your ability. You can look at the soil, and you can do it with a microscope, and you can do it laying on your belly looking into a soil pit. You can zoom clear back out to what this means to your people and what it means to all people to be able to adapt to climate change. When you talk about Piikani Lodge, I'm looking at the website right now, and for our listeners, Piikani Lodge Health Institute is an Indigenous founded and led 501c3 nonprofit organization focused on promoting the health and well-being of the Amskapi Piikani Blackfeet people and lands via work and research that is both translational and relevant to people and biosystems across this nation. That is a gift to us. It's an unearned gift, but it is a gift nonetheless. And part of the gift is your ability, Latrice, to read the soil, read the land, integrate that with the people, and with the challenges that are in front of us and ahead of us.
That's where we'll end the first part of the conversation. Be sure to come back for Latrice's discussion of the management practices her research has suggested. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at attra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATTRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.